All right, third lecture here on the African American Civil Rights Movement. We're going to try filming this with the lights on. Maybe that'll change how the glare and stuff is. If not, I'll fix it in between. So, we've talked about why people protest. We talked about the early background of the African American Civil Rights Movement. Now we're going to talk about some of the gains that that movement makes, right? Some of the things that they win. So again, this timeline is important, okay? We're focusing on this blue area right here. In fact, I'll get on the screen. We're focusing on right here. Those last years of fighting before we get to this quote-unquote free and equal society that we have now, or are supposed to have now for the last 56 years. Right? We're still fighting to get to that green zone. Okay, so again, when we're thinking about all these civil rights fights, I want you to think about it in terms of this timeline. For at least 265 years, there was slavery. Then for the next 100 years, there was legal segregation, so separate but unequal conditions, a white America and a colored America. And it's only been since 1964 that we have had this quote-unquote free and equal society. So that's what I want you to keep in the back of your head. Another thing to keep in the back of your head, talked about a little bit in the last lecture about how many people got lynched. And one of the biggest reasons people got lynched were accusations of rape. Okay, accusations that a black man raped a white woman. Now, there weren't anywhere near the amount of actual rapes that were accused. In fact, there were probably more rapes of white men raping black women because they had no real legal authority to go back at them, right, in a lot of cases. But on this map, what this map represents is how long it was illegal for a black person and a white person or a colored person of any stripe and a white person to get married or be together intimately. They called it anti-miscegenation laws, right? So in the South, we see there in the red, it took until 1967 for it to be legal for a white person and a non-white person to be in a consensual adult relationship or married. In the blue, in the green, they repealed it really long time ago. Good on them, by 1887. In the yellow, including our state of Colorado, it took until sometime between 48 and 67 for it to be legal. Again, this is people's lifetimes, right? My parents were born in 53, so this is during their lifetime. It was illegal in parts of the country for white and non-white people to be together. The president, basically every president's been born. Every president, even Obama was born before 1967. So he was born into a society where it was illegal in the South for black and white to be together. So keep all that stuff in mind when we talk about why we had to have these civil rights fights and why they're important. All right, so first gain we're going to talk about will be the Brown versus Board of Education case. Okay, this is a personal statement made by the Browns, but also legal action by the NAACP. So, a second grader by the name of Linda Brown attended an all-black school in Topeka, Kansas. The school was farther away from her home and much poorer facility, was worse conditions than the local white school that was just down the street. So, they're separate, but they're not equal. So, the Browns sue, and they say that their constitutional rights are being abridged. They're being hurt, they're being broken by this school system. It gets argued by the NAACP. They take it on for free, and the lawyer's name is Thurgood Marshall. In 1954, the case goes in front of the Supreme Court, and in a 9-0 ruling, the Supreme Court overturns separate but equal. They say this is not right, school segregation is not right, so if it's a public school, you need to integrate. This will be the beginning of the end for segregation. I put the was it though because we'll talk about a little bit later in the next PowerPoint about how we're still pretty segregated in our schools. But this would not go without a fight. And we'll talk about that as well here in a minute, that they have to have subsequent other court cases. They have to have other legal proceedings. They got to send in the military multiple times to integrate schools and stuff like that. But Brown versus Board of Education. Important to note that this was not the first court case arguing that school segregation was wrong. There was one in the Southwest. I want to say it was Menendez versus either California or New Mexico. Which was argued through a Latino civil rights organization. It did not win, but the Brown versus Board of Education case is going to use a lot of their information. They're going to work together a bit to help get this court case won. Okay. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. On the left, there's Linda Brown. She's still alive. This is not long ago. This is a lifetime. She's still alive. And then there's a Topeka Journal saying school segregation is banned. Okay, the Supreme Court refutes the doctrine of separate but equal in education. On the right, there's Thurgood Marshall. We'll talk more about him later. So first question, what did Brown versus the Board of Education attempt to end? A, school integration. B, school segregation. C, school funding disputes. Or D, school busing disputes. All right, Brown versus Board 2. So 1 year later, less than 0.5% of public schools in the United States had actually integrated, even though the Supreme Court told them that they had to. So they had another case. The Supreme Court rules in 1955 that all public schools in the U.S. must integrate with all deliberate speed. I want you to think to yourself for 1 minute what all deliberate speed means. If I told you that all of your work for the rest of the year is due with all deliberate speed, but I don't give you an actual date, what does that mean? It means nothing. It's a useless word. It's a useless string of words, I should say. So with all deliberate speed means nothing. Within 10 years of the court ruling in '64, under 3% of schools nationally had actually integrated. Okay, so the integration movement, having children of all colors learning together, was met with what we call massive resistance in the South, but also in the North. Important to remember. Okay, that we forget a lot with the civil rights movement. We all just assume that all the people in the South were just super racist or something. The people in the North were equally as racist as Southerners. They just went about it a little bit differently. But to this day, the biggest civil rights march in U.S. history was in New York City to integrate the schools, and they still have not integrated all of the schools in New York City. So, many schools that did get integrated had to be integrated by force using the police or the National Guard. That'll happen in the north, like in Boston. It'll happen in the south, like in Little Rock, Arkansas. Most of the schools chosen for integration were in poor neighborhoods, where there was already tension due to economic competition, which is going to lead directly to riots and violence. This is another important thing to know. It would have been a lot easier to integrate schools in more wealthy neighborhoods, where the parents were already economically secure, and there wasn't competition in that regard. But they did not do that, because rich people didn't want that, and the government didn't want to run afoul of them. So what they do, they said, hey, all you poor folks who already have issues because you are fighting for the small amount of jobs that are around, now we're going to integrate you guys, and we're going to force you to deal with the brunt of all of these issues. That, of course, was the wrong thing to do, and it's going to lead to a lot of people getting hurt on both sides. It's going to lead to a lot of riots. It's going to lead to a lot of bad things, just because we wanted to placate or be nice to the rich. So, here are some pictures on here. It'll be easier when you look on your actual PowerPoint, but on the left you can see it says, race mixing is communism, right? I mean, only communists want African Americans to have equal rights. There in the middle it says the whites have rights too, because of course having kids that look different than your kids go to school with your kids will take away all of your rights. And then on the right, them protesting around a school bus, because that's how they generally got kids into these schools. They would bus them in, or they would bus white kids out to more, black and brown neighborhoods to go to schools there. So in Boston will be some of the most vicious busing riots that we ever had. So in Boston, they decided to integrate the schools. They're going to bus black kids in, they're going to bus white kids out, and try to make the schools more equal in terms of ethnicities, I suppose. And Boston freaked out. Super liberal Boston. Okay, you can see here on the left, here's a guy, a white guy with an American flag, about to smash it into this black guy's face. The busing riots were so bad that they had to use dummy buses to confuse the rioters, because so many rioters would throw rocks or take shots at the bus that they'd send fake buses with nobody on them to the front of the building, and then they go to the back of the building and have the kids get dropped off. It got so bad that for a couple of years they had 1,000 police officers in the schools, or more than that, I should say, like 2 or 3 feet away from each other to make sure that riots did not happen. What's important also to think about with this, why is it worth all of the hassle? It is proven that having more diverse classrooms increases the learning of all kids, and it does not hurt the learning of any kid. So it's a positive thing. There's no downside to it, other than people's ridiculous attitudes towards race and that sort of thing. So, second question, Brown versus Board of Education 2 stated that schools must integrate A, immediately, B, with haste, C, with all deliberate speed, or D whenever they feel like it. Back-to-back questions. After Brown 2, states generally chose to integrate schools in wealthier areas. Is that true or false? All right. Maybe. There we go. There's the right button. Hit it. There it is. All right. School segregation day. I said we talk about it again. Brown versus Board of Education had many loopholes allowing for the continued school segregation to this day. It will specifically target the South. Like I said earlier, I said we have this idea in civil rights movements that it's just the South that was bad. And we get that idea because back then we produced that idea. We passed laws to reinforce that idea, which ignored all the racism and segregation in the North. New York, California, Illinois, and many other northern or liberal states have never actually integrated their public schools. They use bogus or racist arguments like black and brown kids, their culture doesn't value learning. Which isn't true. I can tell you, coming from a school with lots of black and brown kids, they value learning just as much as anybody else. The largest boycott in the civil rights era was in New York City, like I said, to integrate schools. 460,000 people marched in 1963 to integrate the schools. There was a counter march by white moms who did not want to integrate their schools, and to this day, in New York, the schools are not actually integrated, not fully integrated. The private school movement will start in Virginia to get around the Brown versus Board of Education decision and to keep schools segregated. If it's a private school, Brown versus Board of Education does not apply to you. The other way that our schools are still segregated is through what we call the neighborhood schools sort of program. What that does is you draw a line, right, that says this is the neighborhood that goes to this school and this is the neighborhood that goes to that school. What ends up happening is a lot of these lines are drawn along the redlining sort of lines that we learned about in the last lecture, where that black and brown area gets redlined, gets kind of segregated through housing policies and insurance policies, and then, of course, they draw the line to exclude that area. So you get one school district, here we'll say to the left, that is in a non-redlined area, is mostly in a suburb, and then you get a redlined school district that's in the inner city. You might say, why is that bad? Well, school funding is done, like you see here in the second to last bullet point, school funding is done through property taxes, right? And if we don't insure any homes in a redlined area, if businesses leave this redlined area, then property taxes go down significantly, which means that funding for public education goes down significantly, right? You see this in a big city like Detroit. Detroit schools are falling apart. They got holes in the ceilings, they got holes in the floor, they got rats running around everywhere, and the reason for that is that real estate in Detroit is worth nothing right now. So those kids that live there, sorry you got born here, but I guess your education is just going to have to suck because we can't afford to pay for it because there's no property taxes. So there's a big study done in 2019. Majority white schools, schools with majority white students, got $23 billion more in funding in the year 2019. Okay, that's how we create unequal school systems. Some states have done things to do better with this. The state of Wyoming, right? A very conservative state. They decided to take all property tax money to fund schools, and then they'll divide it up equally, or maybe equitably, which means that schools that need more will get more. We should do that nationwide. Seems like an easy fix to me. Anyways, if you look at the actual numbers, if you say the percentage of white kids that are going to schools that are 50-50 or more, diverse, as I should say, we're nearly as segregated today as we were in 1954. There are a whole bunch of other different things that don't violate the Brown versus Board of Education policy, but still keep our kids separate from each other. So here's a school boycott. Kids left. Okay, it wasn't 300. It was 460,000 people. I said that marched, right? A lot of them were kids that wanted equal opportunities, that wanted to end Jim Crow segregation, that wanted equal chances, as we can see on here. So here's how I say that things aren't exactly fixed, right? That we're still pretty, that we are still pretty segregated with schools. So here is a high school, right? Stuyvesant High School, which is in New York City, in one of the boroughs. In this area around this high school, the Bed-Stuy neighborhood, is like 80%, 60 to 80% black or brown. And of the kids that were selected to go to that school, you had to apply to go to that school. Out of 895, in a neighborhood that's 60 to 80% black and brown, only 7 black kids got it. Here's how they keep schools sort of segregated. And that's not to say that all people involved in education are bad or racist or something like that, but there seem to be some things in the way of actually having our schools be integrated. And we're still at that point right now. All right, number 3, speaking of school integration, the crisis at Little Rock Central High School. This is a personal statement by the kids and also legal action and also some government action here. One of the very few things that Eisenhower will do to try to help the civil rights movement. So, the Little Rock School District and governor, his name was Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas at this time, they did not want to integrate their schools. Okay, the Little Rock 9 were 9 black students that were chosen to integrate into Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas in 1957. Governor Faubus will deploy the Arkansas National Guard to block the students. He claimed that states' rights allowed him to reject integration. Okay, now let's take a big step back in states' rights arguments. Okay, back in the nullification crisis under Andrew Jackson, South Carolina said they could nullify state or federal laws because the states had that right. Of course, we know that failed. Right? We know the federal government laws are above state laws. We will also get the states' rights arguments with the Civil War. Right? It was the states' rights to continue having slavery. Right? So they needed to leave and have their rights or whatever. Right? So now here's another example. It's sort of in that vein where he says it's our right to not allow black kids to go to school with white kids. The president, okay, Dwight Eisenhower, will send in the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army to assist the kids in entering the school. They'll be there for an entire year. Okay, he claims that federal supremacy will allow the schools to be integrated, which is how it works. Federal law is above state law. That's in the Constitution. So for an entire year, there is going to be troops escorting the kids in and out of school, escorting the kids around the school to make sure that there's not fights or people aren't getting jumped or whatever. The students are going to face almost comical amounts of racism if it wasn't so tragic. The amount of violence and hatred that they see. The schools will be closed for an entire year. They will close all of the schools in Little Rock because they knew that the white kids had the ability to go to other schools, whereas the black kids probably didn't have a family that could afford a car. It would be harder for them to go to school. Eventually, the schools will be reopened and they will be integrated. So here's Little Rock Central High School. It's a big high school. I mean, that's an old high school that probably had thousands of kids in it, bigger than us. Cool architecture, by the way. Then here are the kids, right? The Little Rock 9. And then one adult is in there, one of their supervisors, because there's 10 kids in there. But and then on the right, you can see the 101st Airborne taking them in. Now, they got surrounded by mobs almost every day, and at one point, the mob said, hey, just let us hang one of the kids. Then the other 8 can go to school and we'll be happy. Let us kill one kid just because they want to go to school. Luckily, obviously, the army didn't allow that to happen. On the left, there's Orville Faubus, right, who was the governor of the state there, with an awful name, Orville Faubus. And then President Eisenhower there on the right. So next question, Eisenhower had to do what to help integrate Little Rock Central High School? Did he A, have to ask? Did he B, have to make a public statement? Did he C, have to go there himself? Or did he have to D, send in the 101st Airborne? All right, so the Montgomery bus boycott. Quick review on this because we talked about it a little bit already. But the Montgomery bus boycott was civil disobedience. It was economic pressure. It was a personal statement by both Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. So it'll be a bunch of different types of protest. But this begins 100 days after the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till we talked about last time. Remember, he was a young child, a 14-year-old, who went down from Chicago where he lived to visit his cousins in Money, Mississippi. Whistled allegedly at a white woman. That white woman told her husband. That husband and his brother will brutally murder Emmett Till. Just murder. We saw his face in there, and I'm not going to show the picture again, but you can look it up. This murder will be super transformative for the civil rights movement. It's going to motivate a whole lot of other people to get involved and to be done living in that type of society. So this will be a big moment for both Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. Both of them said that this was a moment that inspired them to be more direct in their action. So both of them refused to give up their seat to white riders. There'll be separate incidents, but the Rosa Parks one will catch on. Parks, like we've talked about, was a longtime civil rights advocate, leader of the partial leader of the NAACP, their women's auxiliary. She was involved in a whole lot of other civil rights movement actions before this and after this until she died. But blacks in Montgomery will respond to her arrest with a massive bus boycott that lasted 381 days. They formed what they called the Montgomery Improvement Association, and what that was basically a series of informal Lyfts and Ubers. They would pick each other up, the people that had cars, and they would taxi them around, make sure they got to work. They would walk to work together, do all this stuff. They'd figure out a way to stay together, and they would stay together for more than a year. And that's why it worked. That's why the boycott worked, because the bus system lost a tremendous amount of revenue because a lot of the riders were African American. During this movement, Martin Luther King Jr. will rise to prominence as a leader in the civil rights movement after being chosen as the spokesperson for this boycott. And it ends with a victory with the buses in Montgomery being desegregated. So on the left, you can see a young Dr. King right there. On the right, you can see people marching, picketing during the Montgomery bus boycott. On the left, we got Rosa Parks here in her seat, refusing to give it up for a white man. There's a statue of her in the White House, of her sitting in that seat, which I guess is the thing she's most famous for, but it is a sad indictment on how small our attention span is as people, because she did so much more for so much longer, but we remember her for one little thing. On the right there, she is holding up her number when she's getting her mugshot taken. All right, the next big one will be sit-ins, which was civil disobedience, non-violent against the law, but civil disobedience. Typically, Southern lunch counters did not serve black people. So, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is also known as SNCC, will stage several sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, and in Nashville, Tennessee. So what that means is they'll peacefully sit at lunch counters all day. Right? They'll go and they'll fill up the seats and say, hey, I'd like some eggs, or I'd like a burger, I'd like some coffee, whatever. Of course, they get denied service because they said we don't serve black people. And eventually they'd be met with some violence and arrests. And then another group would come in and take their seats until they get arrested and pulled out. Then another group, then another group, then another group, then another group, until eventually they win. Lunch counters start serving black people. So just by sitting there, just by occupying those seats and making it hard for that business to make money, they forced them to get over their racism at least long enough to get fed. And you can see a couple examples here of different lunch counters being flooded or stocked or seated full with African Americans who weren't getting fed until eventually they win this fight. So what does SNCC stand for? Just talked about them a second ago. Was it A, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, B, the Student Nonviolent Cooperative Coordination, C, the Student Nonviolent Cooperative Committee, or none of these? All right, next one we're going to talk about will be the Freedom Riders. Okay, this is again a personal statement by each person that's involved in it, but it's also legal action out of the NAACP. It's also some civil disobedience as well. So bus facilities were for interstate travel were segregated. So we just talked about the Montgomery bus boycott. So, in the city, right, or inside each state, their buses were getting integrated because of these different protests. But between states, if you're going from Mississippi to, New York, interstate travel was still segregated, at least below the Mason-Dixon line, which means at least in the South. Black and white protesters known as the Freedom Riders decided to travel throughout the South together on buses to protest this. They will be met with violence. They will have buses that people throw dynamite onto, people shoot at, people try to tip over, stuff like that. Eventually, though, they end with a victory again where the Interstate Commerce Committee desegregates bus facilities. So we can see here on the left, okay, in the top corner of that left picture says a colored waiting room, right? And there'll be a white waiting room. There'll be, whites get to get on first. They get the preferred seats, all that sort of stuff, right? So that's what they were protesting against. So you can see here on the right picture there was one of the buses that got dynamited. You can see all these people with the residue of an explosion on them and stuff like that. People got hurt. On the left, another picture of the Freedom Riders, and here on the map, or on the right, there's a map of all their travels. And if you zoom in real close, you look at it real close, when you look at your PowerPoint, there'll be a bunch of little asterisks or little stars on there. Every little star is where there was violence. So there'll be a lot of violence that they are met with as they go on their freedom riding protest tour. So activists who sought to desegregate buses throughout the South were known as what? A, freedom riders, B, bus changers, C, interstate interlopers, or D, travel activists? All right, James Meredith. A personal statement and legal action involving him. He was an African-American student who attempted to enroll in all-white University of Mississippi, what we call Ole Miss. So he wants to go to school there. And the governor of that state of Mississippi, Russ Barnett, claims again that they have the state's right to prevent integration. So very similar to the Little Rock Central thing, but another state over in Mississippi and now in college. President John F. Kennedy, at this point, JFK, sends 5,000 troops to ensure that Meredith could enroll. He'll try to walk in. Governor Barnett himself will be standing in front of the door to the admissions office telling him he cannot enter. So JFK calls him, tries to negotiate. Those calls got leaked and all this stuff like that. That doesn't work out, so he says, screw it, sends 5,000 troops in. 5,000 troops to make sure one kid could go to school. There will be riots because people freaked out that that kid wanted to go to school. 2 people are going to die in this because people could not stand the idea of a black kid going to the University of Mississippi. In the end, Meredith will enroll and Ole Miss will be forced to integrate. So there'll be a victory again here as well. On the left, there's James Meredith. In the middle, that's the University of Ole Miss. There's a great, if you're into college football, there's a great movie from ESPN called The Ghosts of Ole Miss. They had a really good football team this year, and that year, I should say, and things got kind of upended. On the right, you see Meredith there carrying his briefcase surrounded by Secret Service agents, FBI agents, and members of the armed forces to make sure that he did not get shot while he was there. Meredith, after going to school there, will be a civil rights activist for the rest of his life. So how many troops did JFK have to send to Ole Miss to force them to admit James Meredith? A, none. B, 100 troops. C, 1,000 troops. Or D, 5,000 troops. All right, Birmingham. Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. They called it Bombingham because of how many bombings occurred, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But Birmingham, Alabama was the most segregated city in the South. And I quote that because that's what the mayor there said, that's what the police department there said, and they were prideful in that they kept their city segregated. So protesters, including Martin Luther King Jr., his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC that we just talked about, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the NAACP are all going to focus on this city. Because if they can't integrate the most segregated city in the South, then they can integrate anywhere. So, why do we call it Bombingham? Because there were 18 bombings between 1957 and 1963 where black people were targeted, including, most infamously, a church bombing that'll kill 4 innocent teenage girls. Martin Luther King Jr.'s house there in Birmingham was bombed at one point when he and his family luckily were not there. So there'll be a lot of bombings targeting the black community. King and his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, will hold marches throughout the city multiple times. Many will be arrested, many will be beaten. The police chief there, whose name was Bull Connor, was sort of what you think about stereotypically as a ridiculously racist Southern official who wanted to keep the city segregated, the country segregated. He will use attack dogs and water hoses on the protesters. All of this, for the first time, will be caught on national television, international television. Everybody will see it, and it will horrify the nation to see the kind of treatment that these people were going through. JFK will famously say that segregation is now everyone's problem because it was seen by everybody. So after all this stuff, some integration does occur, but JFK very famously proposes the Civil Rights Bill, which will eventually become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which will be extremely important legislation in ending segregation in our country. So here's the bombing that killed these 4 young girls. Eventually, the man who left the bomb was found guilty, but it would take until, I believe, the 90s for him to be found guilty of what he did, killing these innocent children. On the left, some protesters being sprayed by high-pressure water hoses. So it's like what the fire department uses to put out a fire in a 30-story building. They're pointing it at people and spraying them. On the right, I've showed you this picture before as well, but just look how calm this guy is as he's getting attacked by a police dog, just for marching. Another picture of kids getting sprayed by the Birmingham Fire Department right in the face with a high-pressure hose. All right, next question. How many bombings rocked Birmingham between 57 and 63? Was it 5, 11, 18, or 23? All right, the March on Washington is a huge group demonstration and legal action. 300,000 protesters will attempt to pressure Congress to pass JFK's civil rights bill. So I said he proposed it after Birmingham. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom will be a march to put pressure on elected officials to pass that bill. Marchers also wanted jobs or programs aimed at jobs and welfare, which is why they call it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Part of the reason why it's so famous is this is where Martin Luther King gives the most famous civil rights speech, his I Have a Dream speech. Eventually, it'll be another year. New President Lyndon Johnson passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after JFK gets assassinated in Dallas. They do this as sort of a legacy thing for JFK. So the pressure from protesters plus the pressure to honor JFK after his assassination will help get this bill passed, which is one of the most important bills we passed in modern American history. So, pictures of the March on Washington. See how many people were there crowding around the reflecting pool between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Monument. And then there's Martin Luther King about to give his speech. So about how many protesters or marchers attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms? 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, or 400,000. All right, so that Civil Rights Act, what was in it? Okay, it was proposed by JFK in '63, faced stiff opposition by Congress and the Senate. The March on Washington pressures them. JFK gets assassinated, and LBJ is able to get the bill passed in '64. So, what does it do? It officially ends segregation in public places and bans discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This law is used by all sorts of different groups of people to preserve the rights that were supposed to be given to them in the Constitution. A very important piece of legislation. All right, going along through our timeline here. Next thing, the Mississippi Summer Freedom Project, 1964, which will be legal action. It will be personal statements, but also will be martyrdom because people will die. So the goal here is to register black people to vote in Mississippi. At this point, only 5% of black people were registered. There was all sorts of intimidation for black people trying to vote. There were lynchings. There was violence. There was out-and-out fraud in elections and stuff like that. So more than 1,000 volunteers are going to go to Mississippi to try to register voters. They're going to face resistance and intimidation, including 3 of their volunteers getting murdered. And involved in the murder will be the police department in that part of Mississippi where they are killed. Eventually that will be uncovered, but that'll be a lot later. The victory here is that 1,200 new voters were registered. And after the Voting Rights Act gets passed, which we'll talk about here in a bit, more people will get registered. So these are the 3 men here on the left who will get killed for trying to register black people to vote in Mississippi in 1964. On the middle you see a picture of the Mississippi Summer Freedom Project, and then on the right you see the monument to the murders. So how many Mississippi Summer Freedom Project